Welcome to this next Teachappy vlog, and I'm delighted to have as my guest today Dr Lucy Foulkes, who is an academic psychologist at UCL, also at the Anna Freud National Centre for Children and Families, and she's also a writer, and I read her book this summer called What Mental Health Illness Really Is and What It Isn't. And it was, so welcome Lucy for a start.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, and it was after reading your book at the beginning of my summer holidays that made me want to reach out and interview for this vlog, because I think there's some really interesting takeaways from your books, and I think it's really relevant for teachers, school leaders, governors, anyone working in schools in the UK, well, and further afield, because schools are expected, I think, to do more and more to look after and promote children and teachers' mental health and well-being. So I'm going to get straight into the first question, because I think it's a really important one. And the question is, what is mental illness and how does it differ from what we might call kind of typical psychological pain or suffering?
Yeah, well, I think what I wanted to make a big point of in the book is that there isn't a dichotomy between those two things, and that all symptoms of mental health problems exist on a spectrum of kind of gradually increasing severity, but that there's no sort of line in nature where you might say that, you know, this is what we would call mental illness or disorder. And, you know, there is a sort of some individuals feel like we should never use the word illness or disorder, so it's really not a clear-cut thing. But the way I find it useful to think about it is, like, if you think about what are the things that would move you gradually up that spectrum, so it might be experiencing these symptoms more frequently or more severely, or things that you might have less control over, like, you know, less control over your worrying, for example. You might find it more distressing. And also, importantly, in terms of thinking about whether something becomes a disorder or not, in inverted commas, is whether it's affecting your ability to live your life the way you want to. So it's, if you start having thoughts, feelings, and or behaviours that are moving up towards the top end of that spectrum on, you know, several of those facets, then it might be useful to start calling it an illness or disorder.
And what I found useful in your book is kind of comparing what we might call a mental illness, so that severity, the frequency, and it impairing you being able to live the life that you want to lead, how it differs to, say, what might be, some people might call just typical normal psychological pain or distress. So, for example, if you go through a breakup, you might go through certain psychological symptoms and issues. If you suffer a bereavement, if you fail an important exam, like, all of these things have an impact on how we feel and how we behave. But yeah. So how do we know if what we're going through is, you know, a kind of typical response to a challenging situation, or if there's something more?
Well, I think even that is a really difficult way of trying to divide it up, because then that sort of implies that if there's an understandable cause, that therefore it can't be an illness. But you know, often things that do end up usefully being called disorders, you know, they have a very understandable cause in the real world. You know, that's what PTSD is, but also, you know, lots and lots of other disorders are often sort of triggered or exacerbated by something very real. So even that's tricky, because then it's like, you don't want to imply that if there's a sort of legitimate cause, that therefore the symptoms that you're presenting with now don't count or don't need intervention. So I think it's, and equally you can have people who have very little sort of external triggers, and they're still they still end up incredibly distressed and unwell. So for me, it's more useful. I mean, obviously, when you're sort of treating someone, it's useful to think about the whole picture. But for me, if you're trying to understand whether something counts as a disorder or not, I wouldn't want to dismiss things that had a sort of understandable cause. But yeah, you're absolutely right, and you sort of touch on what's so complicated about this is that everyone will go through periods of distress, and sometimes acute distress, and bereavement is a really good example of that. But we should be cautious about automatically framing that as a disorder, I guess.
Mm-hmm.